our debt to GDP is very misleading because our GDP is so much, personal spending, 70% or so. I mean, if you look at the wealth generating part of our GDP, the manufacturing, mining, the productive part, the debt is enormous relative to any other country in the world. And so our GDP can implode very quickly and the debt doesn't, right? The debt stays the same. And the way our GDP would implode is the dollar goes down and interest rates go up and people can't afford to spend anymore. So the spending stops and so the economy implodes, but the debt's still there. And so then our debt to GDP goes way up. I think Trump is most likely going to win. I've thought that even from before Biden's had his debate. When they brought out Harris and they tried to hype her up, I didn't think the public was going to buy what they were selling, that she was a flawed candidate. So he's probably going to win. And the market knows that, and price of gold keeps going up anyway. So I don't think that a Trump win is going to cause gold to go down. I do think that if Trump wins, it may cause U.S. investors not to buy gold because most of the gold buyers are Republicans, and they stopped buying gold when Trump was elected the first time because they believed that, hey, he's going to make America great again. He's going to do all this great stuff, so I don't have to worry and I don't have to buy gold. And of course, he didn't do anything that he promised. The budget deficits went up. The trade deficits went up. He didn't drain the swamp. The swamp just got deeper. We just continued to pursue the reckless deficit spending that we had under Obama. And I see nothing that would change that other than a crisis. But Trump is not going to accelerate that crisis by doing the right thing. I think it's going to be more of the wrong thing. But there will be a lot of false optimism that Trump's going to actually do something constructive. Now, he may be less destructive than a Harris administration or whoever is going to end up pulling the strings behind the scenes, because I don't think she has a clue what to do about anything. I think she's just going to do what people tell her to do, but the people that are telling her what to do are not going to be telling her the right thing to do. So I think gold goes up no matter what, but I think people will be more interested in buying gold if Kamala Harris wins. Certainly my clients at Schiff Gold will want to buy more gold because they'll be more worried with Kamala at the helm. But maybe gold would sell off if she won initially, if gold's been rising based on the idea that Trump is going to be more inflationary than Harris, which I think is a stretch. I mean, even if Trump increases the deficits with his tax cuts, she's going to increase the deficits by probably more with her spending increases. Although Trump's going to spend more too. He spent more the first time he was in office. He just spent less than what Hillary would have spent. And Harris is going to spend more than Trump. But either way, it's going to be financed with a deficit. I mean, I think the tariffs that Trump wants to impose, they'll raise some revenue, not from the Chinese, from Americans. The Americans pay the tariffs, not the Chinese. So that will provide some revenue. But of course, there's going to be income tax cuts and other tax cuts that'll offset that. So it could end up being a net loss of revenue for the government, not a net gain. Before 1913, the government was able to run predominantly on tariffs, or not predominantly, that was maybe about 40% of its revenue, but most of their revenue was either tariffs or they taxed liquor, tobacco, fire, stuff like that. They ran on excise taxes, indirect taxes, which is what the Constitution envisioned would finance the government in peacetime. It was only during wartime that they thought they might go to a direct tax, and that's why they made it very difficult for the government to levy a direct tax. But back then, in 1913, the federal government spent less than 2% of our GDP. So when you have a tiny federal government that doesn't spend a lot of money, you can cover the spending with tariffs. And, Donald Trump mentioned in his speech, the period of time between 1870 and 1890 as, the glory days of the Gilded Age, and talked about how we ran on tariffs. And the government ran budget surpluses for 15 out of those 20 years. So out of those 2 decades, the government actually ran a surplus 3/4 of the time with only indirect taxes. There was no income tax, either personal or corporate. There was no payroll tax, no Social Security, no Medicare. But the government was small. Today, the government, the federal government, not even counting the states, just the federal government spends 24% of our GDP. So it's more than 12 times as big as it was before we had the income tax. And that's not a coincidence. The reason the government is so big is because we have an income tax. That's what enabled the government to get the revenue to grow. If they didn't have a direct line into our pockets, they never could have expanded the way they did. So it would be great to go back to the 1913 tax system, but that means we have to go back to the 1913 government. So we got to get rid of Social Security, Medicare, Obamacare, all the stuff that the government does now that it didn't do back then. But we had a better country before the government did all this stuff. We had a more prosperous country. Economic growth was more than twice as high before we had the income tax as it is now. And it was real economic growth that went from the bottom up. People were lifted out of poverty. People were coming to America, millions at a time. Immigrants were pouring into America because we were free and prosperous, because we didn't have a big government. We didn't have all this social welfare. People just came here and went to work. And everybody benefited from the freedom that we had when government was small. And now people are suffering from the freedoms we lost because government is big. And government got big with the income tax. And ironically, people don't know this, it was a trade-off. What the politicians at the time said to the people is, you're paying all these tariffs. Why don't we have an income tax on the rich so we can get Carnegie and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt? We can get those super rich guys to pay an income tax of like 1 or 2%. And they can afford it because they're super rich, right? They're not paying their fair share. So let's put a little tax on the rich, and then we can get rid of the tariffs that are falling on the middle class and the poor. And that was the deal. And that's what they said. Yes, we need an income tax so we can get rid of tariffs. Because everybody knew back then that the middle class paid the tariffs and the rich would pay the income taxes. And now what Trump is promising is to bring back the tariffs, but that actually goes on the middle class. But he's trying to pretend that the middle class isn't going to pay it, that China's not going to pay it. But, ironically, the initial tax rates that they bandied about, was 1-2%. I think the max was 6%. Like that was the highest. And I think there was the initial income tax, they thought about putting a cap of 6%. I think they said, well, no, they didn't want to put a cap that high because they thought people might actually get up there. They didn't even expect it to get that high. But it didn't take long before the income tax got to 80-90%. And by 1942, when the Second World War started, we had the income tax for the withholding tax for the first time, and Americans were paying 30, 40, 50% tax. Middle-class Americans were paying income taxes at rates never imagined for the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. So that's what happens. You make a deal with the devil, right, and you're going to get screwed. The voters were conned into allowing a tax that was only going to apply to the super rich and only very small rates, and then that very tax ended up applying to everybody at rates much, much higher. So you never want to give the government a club with the belief that they're going to use it only on the rich. Because the minute they get that club, they're going to smash it right on you, right? And that's what they're trying to do now with a wealth tax or unrealized gains. Oh, don't worry about it. It's only going to be for the rich. Yeah, that's the camel's nose under the tent. The minute they get power under the guise that they're going to use it against the rich, right, they end up using it against everybody. But, there are a lot of things the government does that are unconstitutional. So, the question is, could they get away with it? They might. It depends on the judges. If the judges are honest and enforce the Constitution, they won't. But if they ignore the Constitution under the guise of interpreting it and just allow it, there's a lot of unconstitutional laws on the books. It's much better to tax consumption from an economic perspective, from an individual liberty perspective. Look, when you pay an indirect tax, which is a sales tax or a tariff or a value-added tax, it's very simple. I buy a product, the tax is included in there. I don't have to write a check to the government. Right. I don't have to hire a lawyer or an accountant. I don't have to keep books and records. I don't have to tell the government everything about me, right? All my doctors, all my charities, all my income, everything I spend. The U.S. government knows more about Americans than your typical communist government would know about their citizens. We furnish the government with all sorts of personal information. There's no privacy at all. We give all that up. We have an entire industry, right? How much do we waste just complying with the income tax on accountants and lawyers and audits? From a civil liberty perspective, it's much better not to have to keep track of what you earned. Just buy stuff and the taxes are included. You don't have to do anything, right? So that's the simplest system. And it's also self-corrective as to abuse. That's why the founding fathers loved excise taxes, because if they make the tax too high, I'm just not going to buy the product that's subject to the tax, and you're going to collect nothing, right? So if the government makes an indirect tax too high, they don't get the revenue. But when they can tax you directly, if they can just say, we're going to tax you, we're going to take your money from you, you can't avoid that. They can have a just capitation. They say everybody has to pay, everybody send us $1,000, every man, woman, and child. You got to do it. But even an income tax, you need income because you have to work, you have to eat. So they know you're going to have to work. And so they just tax you directly. And even as they jack up the tax, now obviously at some point there is some self-correction. If they made the income tax 100%, nobody would work because you get nothing. At 90%, very few people would work. Most people would say, screw it, I'm not going to work for 10 cents on the dollar, I'm not working. I mean, that's the Laffer curve, where Laffer on his napkin, because they try to find the optimal point where the tax rate, where people will keep working so the government keeps collecting taxes. Because as you increase the tax on income, you reduce the incentive to earn income. But at some lower level, the tax on income might actually encourage you to work because you need more money because the government is taking some of what you earn. But also, the main thing from an economic perspective, if you're going to get less of what you tax and more of what you subsidize, right? Whatever you tax, I love it. That's like an economic law. You don't want to tax people for working and being productive, because why would you want less productivity and less work? You would want more work. So it's better not to tax people on what they earn, but on what they spend. Right? So don't tax them on what they put into the economic pot, tax them on what they take out. Now, a lot of people don't like that because they say, well, a millionaire or a rich guy, let's say somebody earns $100 million a year, but only spends $10 million on jets and yachts and vacations, whatever. And so 90 million they don't spend. Hey, that's not fair, right? Because, you're only taxing 10% of his income, whereas a middle class guy that earns $75,000 a year spends every penny, right? The rich guy who's spending 10% of a huge number is paying a lot of taxes on that stuff. But the money that he doesn't spend, where is that money going? Is he taking that money and burying it in a hole in the ground? No, it's being invested in the economy. It's there as capital that's being loaned out or invested to entrepreneurs so that we can have capital investment and grow businesses and create jobs. When you're earning money and not spending it, you're a benefactor to society. Right? So it's the playboy that is squandering money, right? Yeah, tax that guy. Right? If somebody is spending all their money on wine and women and whatever, sure, tax all that stuff. But somebody like a Warren Buffett, who is very frugal with his money, has all this money, but he lives in a modest home, he drives a modest car. Well, why would you want to tax that guy when all he's doing is using his wealth to grow the economy and benefit everybody? All the money eventually is going to get spent by somebody. If it's not the guy that earned it, well, his heirs will get around to spending it. And so tax people when they spend their money. The only problem with the transition, if we go from an income tax to a consumption tax, we've already taxed the hell out of people when they earn the money. And now we're going to tax them when they spend the same money that we already taxed them to earn. Well, it's definitely not the best place, certainly to get started, younger people getting started. There are other countries where it's better, where you have fewer rules and regulations, places like Singapore and Switzerland and Dubai, and there are a lot of other places too that it's easier because you have fewer regulations, you have fewer government interference in the economy, and you have low to no income tax. So at one time, America was the best place to start a business. It's not anymore. It's not the worst place, right? I mean, there's still a lot going on here, but it could be a lot better than it is. But the problem is that, we're going to have this crisis that's coming that's going to make it even worse. I mentioned on my own podcast yesterday, but we came out with our merchandise trade deficit, almost $109 billion in the month of October. It was the worst trade deficit we've ever had, with the exception of 1 month, which was the month that we opened the economy after COVID, and we had months and months of pent-up imports that had been piling up on the docks because there was nobody there because they were all at home under quarantine. We finally opened up the ports and all this backlog shipped in, and so that was the only month that was a bigger trade deficit than the month we just reported. So that is a huge problem, that our economy is so screwed up that we cannot produce the things that we consume, and we are more reliant than ever on the productivity of the rest of the world because they have the factories that we don't. And the only reason that they're willing to sell us what they produce is because we've got the reserve currency for now. But once the world abandons the dollar, then we have no ability to import those goods.